Perfect timing. Hi, everybody. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. We're so excited to have you all for class today. Today's topic is federalism, and I get the lucky day to be with our top scholar, Tom Donnelly. So Tom, you want to do an introduction?
Absolutely. Hi, my name's Tom Donnelly. I am a senior fellow for constitutional studies at the National Constitution Center. And just thanks so much for being with us today. Federalism touches everything in the Constitution, all of our constitutional history. We have a lot to cover, but it's an amazingly important topic and an interesting one. So back to you, Kerry.
So as we go through today's class, if you have questions or need clarity on anything, make sure you use that chat box. We're here to help, and we're here to make sure what we're saying is nice and clear and everybody gets a strong foundation in federalism. And this is why we started off with topics like constitutional convention and federalism, so everybody has a good foundation, because like Tom said, we're going to see it all year long in every class. So we better know what it means. And that's where we're going to begin today. Any questions, go in the chat or the Q&A. But Tom, what we really need to know is, what is federalism? And then why did the founding generation put it in the Constitution? And how is it even in the Constitution? Is it in one section? Is it all over? Kind of give us the rundown.
Sure. No, that's great. And, you know, as always, Kerry, we'll obviously begin with the Constitution's text. But even before that, you know, it'd be good to have a simple definition on the table just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what is federalism? Well, federalism, it's the word used to describe the Constitution's system of dividing power between the national government and the states. So it's really two related questions. What powers go to the national government and what powers go to the states? And so if we're thinking about this, you know, where do we find federalism in the Constitution? Is there a federalism clause? Does the word end up in the Constitution at all? No, it doesn't. It's a little, in that sense, it's not so obvious that I could just say, Article 4, the federalism article. It's not like that. But if you look closely, once we understand what federalism is, it's everywhere. It's everywhere, and it shouldn't come as a surprise, because federalism is one of the underlying principles of our entire constitutional system. This question of how do we strike a balance between the powers of the national government and the powers of the states. So if we're looking at the Constitution, where do we see this? Let's just sample a couple of different provisions in the Constitution that give a flavor for how it deals with federalism. So, you know, the most obvious place to look is in Article 1 of the Constitution. So this is where we establish Congress and we talk about its various powers. So if we look at Article 1, Kerry has some of the provisions listed here. Article 1, Section 3 gives us the United States Senate, so one of the houses of our national legislature. And if we think back, the Senate protects federalism because, one, it's based on the principle of equal representation. So each state gets 2 senators. This was the Great Compromise. This was the Connecticut Compromise, whatever you want to call it. But each state gets 2 senators. And under the original Constitution, those senators are selected by the state legislature. And so within this original structure, we have part of our national legislature there to protect the power to speak for the states, regardless of their size. Whether they're big or small, they get 2 senators. So that roots sort of our principle of government and representation in state power. Then if we take the next 2 provisions there and you know, they give us a sense of the other key debate, which is how are we going to distribute power with this new Constitution? And so with Article 1, Section 8, this is where we lay out many of the powers of Congress, of the national government. So powers like taxing and spending, regulating interstate commerce, so dealing with economic issues that touch the states, being able to raise an army, being able to raise money. So these are the powers of Congress. If you look ahead a little further in the Constitution to Article 1, Section 10, we then see some limitations on state governments. Because the thing to remember is before we have this new Constitution, the states are doing pretty much all of our governing. And they're going to continue, as we'll talk about, they're going to continue to play a central role in American government. But here the new Constitution says there are certain things, states, that you can't do. And this is a way, I think the way to think about it is these are defining things that are distinctly national, things that we really think a national government has to do. So what's a quintessential, what's a classic example of this? Establishing treaties with foreign governments. We want the national government, we want to speak as one nation in that sort of thing. And so we want the national government to do that. We don't want the states to do that. And so that sort of gives you a sense of the distribution of powers in Article 1. Just to tick off 3 very quick additional ones, just so we have a concrete sense of federalism in the Constitution, let's fast forward to Article 6 there, the Supremacy Clause. So this is the part of the original Constitution that's saying something very simple. When the national government passes a law, and that law is constitutional, it is above laws passed by the states. So we still do have to ask the question, did the national government have the power to pass law X? But if it does, and there's a conflict between national law and state law, the national law wins. And so this sets up that power. It's a hierarchical, it's a power of one above the other. But again, the fundamental question first is always, does the national government have the power? And we'll get to that as we talk a little bit about debates through history. And then if we just look at different amendments to the Constitution, one is in the original Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment is protecting the principle of federalism. And what it's really saying is it's recognizing that states have played a central role in governance over time, and they're retaining their traditional powers. Here's the text. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And so what this is saying is the new Constitution's giving the national government new powers. But those powers that the states already had that haven't been taken away by Article 1, Section 10, that don't fly in the face of the new powers of Congress, of the national government, they stay with the states, and so the states are gonna do a lot. And the last part is, if you look at right at the bottom of this slide, the enforcement clauses of the Reconstruction Amendments. These are the amendments that we passed after the Civil War that abolished slavery, that promised freedom and equality, that banned racial discrimination in voting. And what these amendments did that previous amendments didn't do is it granted new power. They granted new powers to the national government. The key text, and they're called enforcement clauses. It's just a fancy name for saying, Congress, you have new powers. New powers defined by these amendments to strike out at slavery, to promote freedom, to promote equality, to protect the right to vote of people from being discriminated against based on race at the polling place. And the key language in these enforcement clauses says, the Congress shall have the power. That's how they start. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So Congress shall have the power. Now, does this mean the Congress is suddenly supreme in all things and all items? Of course not. But it does give Congress new powers and strikes a new balance between the powers of the national government and of the states. So that's a little overview, Kerry. I'm happy to take any questions or figure out where to go from there.
No, I think that's great. I think, framing this as this is how our balance of power works in our country between a national government and state governments and even local governments as well. That's the idea of federalism. So there's a mixture of power and understanding when needs are for the country as a whole, that's going to be given to the national. And it makes sense. If we think about when the Constitution is written, after the Declaration of Independence, after we win the war, and during the Articles of Confederation that aren't working, we need a way that the national government can speak for every state, all of us, like a family, like a team. Now, I wanted to point out to the students, you can see Article 1, Article 3, all the articles make up that what we call the structural constitution, or you can even call it the original Constitution. That the original Constitution is broken up into articles. Then when we add things to it, we amend it, and then they're called amendments. So this is not just looking at that original Constitution, but some of the amendments over time. And when we think about the Constitution today, we think about the whole shebang, the entire thing. I love the 10th Amendment because the 10th Amendment always felt like a way to make sure the worries of people saying that the federal government could be too big. The 10th Amendment says, whoa, 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 don't worry. If they don't have the power, it goes back to the states. But the Supremacy Clause is also in there to make sure everybody knows that the national government and the Constitution reigns supreme. So, sometimes these words sound confusing, but if you break them down and think about what they're saying, they kind of make complete sense. So, Tom, that was a great overview. You walked us through, we just did a story walk through the Constitution, seeing the parts and pieces and understanding that the idea of federalism is spread out. And for the teachers in the group, I like to call it the ragu, because it's in there. It's all over, it's the ragu. Federalism's the ragu of the Constitution. It's all in there. If you guys remember that commercial from like 20 years ago. Now, why did they do it? So I understand like federalism is a way to separate power, giving the power to the national government to do things that we want done for us as a unit, as a team, as a group. And we don't want Delaware making a treaty. We want the United States making a treaty for our country. And then there's powers delegated to the states, delegated to the local areas. But why did they do that? What was the reasoning? Why was federalism a good idea? And what was the like energy around it? And if you guys want to chime in on this, why do you think the founding fathers thought separating power was a good idea to build our Constitution like that? I'll give you guys a minute to think about that. And then Cecilia, we'll talk a little bit at the end of how do we add an amendment. And we have a whole entire class on Article 5, which is
one of my favorites.
I know, I'm so excited to do that. I feel like it's in February, but I could be wrong, but I'll look it up. So you guys think about why did they break it up? And then we're going to turn it back to Tom. What was the idea behind it, Tom? What would make federalism? Why wouldn't they just give all the power to the national government? I know that scares a lot of people.
Yeah, no, it's fun. And people chime in as I'm speaking. By all means, don't be shy. So yeah, let's before we tell, so we can talk specifically about the convention a little bit. But first, I just want to get exactly what you're saying, Kerry. Is like, so what's the big idea? What was the founding generation thinking? And sort of how has federalism been implemented over time? How has it been of value to our constitutional system? So let's begin with, just thinking about what did the founding generation have in mind here? What's the value of different layers of government? Well, for them, what they're really thinking about is it's an important way, federalism is an important way of bringing government as close as possible to the American people. And so from their perspective, the state governments are the form of government that's closest to the people. They have even then, we're a diverse nation of diverse needs, whether, we have a lot of farmers or we have a lot of merchants or whatever, the different states are going to be interested in doing different things. Different communities are going to be interested in doing different things. And so if we think back to that core idea at the founding of popular sovereignty, or as Lincoln put it, government of the people, by the people, for the people, federalism and carving out this role for the state governments to do a lot of things is consistent with the founders really wanting to bring government as close as possible to the American people so that government can satisfy their needs. So how does this work over time? Well, there are sort of two ways in which, I would say three ways in which this is of value. One is very simply what I already said the founders were looking for, which is we're a diverse nation with different states looking to do different things in different policy areas. And by ensuring real power for the states to set policies in areas like education or the environment or safety or health, different states can take different approaches to policy issues. Full stop. That's one thing. That sort of diversity where state policy, what states are doing, can match what a diverse population is looking for. But what we also see is a certain dynamic in the relationship between the national government and the states that this sets up. So one is that over time, states can take diverse approaches to different issues, and then sometimes the nation as a whole learns from these experiences. And so it's this famous quote from 1932 by Justice Louis Brandeis, a justice I love, but is one of the absolute heroes of our boss, Jeffrey Rosen, and rightfully so, is one of the great justices in the history of the Supreme Court. And he talks about states as laboratories of democracy. And the idea here is that states will have the power, the authority to try out all sorts of different approaches to things like education, to things like, how to regulate the economy, to how to promote people's health and people's safety. And then over time, other states will learn from those state experiences, and maybe they'll adopt the policies that work. And so how concretely has this worked? Let's take just a really amazing example, the example of the women's right to vote. So we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which protects women's right to vote. But the 19th Amendment didn't come out of nowhere. In fact, women were voting throughout the United States before the 19th Amendment was ratified. And this experiment began in the late 19th century out west. So Western states like Wyoming, Utah, Colorado began allowing women to vote. Over time, women participated in the political process in that way, went to the polling places. Other states saw that this worked reasonably well. And over time, more and more states, up until 1919, 1920, when we ratified the 19th Amendment, grant women either the full right to vote on equal terms with men or allow them to vote in certain elections, like presidential elections, school board elections. But we have a tradition of women's voting that happens even before the 19th Amendment writes it into the US Constitution. So these are states learning from those Western states, seeing that women can vote, women are going to vote responsibly as men, and therefore we should expand the right to vote to cover women. And so that's an amazing story of a constitutional right bubbling up from below. The flip side is that we are giving the national government new power to step in and check the states. We are saying that the national government has authority to pass new laws in a variety of areas. And when they pass those laws, they can step in and say, states, you can't act in way X anymore. And so and this applies to all people, it applies to all states. What's the classic example of this? One of the classic examples is Jim Crow discrimination in the South. And so here we see states using their traditional powers to pass laws that discriminate against African Americans, that make African Americans second-class citizens. And in response to the civil rights movement, and in response to protests over time, we finally see, roughly 100 years after we write the promise of equality into the Constitution with the 14th Amendment, Congress acting to promote racial equality in landmark laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And here is a place where what Congress is doing is saying, we have power under the Constitution, under the 14th Amendment, under the 15th Amendment, even under the original Constitution and our commerce power to regulate the economy. We have power to pass these laws that ultimately realize the promise of the Reconstruction Amendments, its promise of equality, and we're going to do it in states. You can't act otherwise. And so you see here a bubbling up from below, but also the ability of the national government to say, stop. That's not how we do it in America.
So, and I think that's it. You can see the federalism ping-ponging back and forth. When is it better for the ideas to bubble up from the states? And when do bad ideas bubble up from the states and the national government push it back down? So I think one of my favorite parts about federalism is that you do have this balance between what the national government can do and what the states can do. And there's room for experimentation. But when individuals are then being stepped upon, the national government can come back in. But Tom, I think the thing that you say that's so important is it took them over 100 years to use the power that the national government had to fix that and to change it. And so when we look at federalism, we're going to look in a little bit at how we're seeing federalism every day in our lives, but understanding that it's a mixed system, because just like checks and balances, just like separation of powers, if you give one group all the power, then there's an issue with it. But if you spread out the power over people, then they can check each other. And that's why federalism was spelled out this way, to be able to spread out that power through the national, state, and local governments, but then again, spread it out across the national government as well. So really mixing in the idea of federalism and separation of powers. Tom, I know we're gonna kind of jump through and we're in 17 in. So what I was thinking we could dive into really quickly now is one of the ways that another branch stepped into federalism to help explain it. And a great classic court case that maybe our middle schoolers haven't gotten to it yet, or maybe they have, but one that they'll definitely hit when they're jumping into AP classes or any kind of advanced high school levels too. So let's look at this canonical case.
It is a canonical case. In many ways, the canonical case, McCulloch v. Maryland. So this is a case that came before the Supreme Court in the early 1800s. It involves, the great Justice John Marshall, and importantly, what it does is it tackles this classic federalism question of what is the scope of the national government's power, and the specific issue it addresses is one of the great debates in early America, which is the constitutionality of a national bank. Now, for those of you who love Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, this is part of what is being debated in that cabinet battle #1 in Lin-Manuel Miranda's excellent musical. So if you want to, learn a little bit more, that's one place where you can get it. But the idea here is, we have a new government. And so this story for McCulloch really plays out in 2 acts. The first is absolutely at the beginning, where we're in George Washington's cabinet, George Washington's administration, and then fast forwarding to this Supreme Court case, McCulloch v. Maryland, which is a couple decades later. So beginning with George Washington, what we're dealing with here is in the Washington administration, the first Congress, we have a new constitution. We don't really know. We have to debate, what does it mean? What's the new government going to look like? What sort of policies is it going to enact? And this raises a slew of important constitutional questions like the one we're talking about today, which is how much power goes to the national government and how much power remains with the states.
Thank you, Tom, for saying that, because that's always the question. Whose power, how much power, and then where's the push and pull? And that goes back forth to ping pong, whose job is it? Yes, because that's the question when we look at COVID, when we look at elections, whose job is it, and how much power do they have, and what kind of power do they have? So this is a great case, but this is why we're going to use it so we can look at something modern too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will certainly get to those questions too. I mean, what's so cool about this case is this first act, which is, where the Washington cabinet is debating the national bank. It involves an amazing cast of characters. You have George Washington as president. You have Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury. You have Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State. You have James Madison serving in the US House of Representatives and one of the leaders in the House. And so we have Hamilton here. He's the central character in this story in a lot of ways. And what he says, he's a strong believer in a strong national government. And what he says is that what a national government needs is it needs to really direct the economic policy of the nation. And it's important. One of the things you really want to have is you want to establish a national bank to help give the national government some power over the economy, over finance. From Hamilton's perspective, this is precisely what national governments do. This is what the great nations of Europe do. This is something the states acting individually can't do effectively, and it's something that has to be done by the national government. And so he sets out his famous economic plan, which goes before Congress, establishes a national bank, and this ends up in front of George Washington, the president, who has to decide, do I support this policy? Do I think that we should have a national bank? But more importantly for Washington, because he's setting new precedents about he said, sort of a new standard of what the national government can do. He wants to know, is something like the national bank constitutional? And so this is what's pretty amazing about this story is even before we get to McCulloch v. Maryland, here in Washington's cabinet, Washington says, Alexander Hamilton, what do you think? You're the Secretary of the Treasury. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, great founder. What do you think? Is this constitutional? Madison's weighing in the US House of Representatives. Is this constitutional? And these great founders come out differently on this particular issue. Hamilton says, yes, this is constitutional. The national government can pass a national bank. But Jefferson and Madison, remember, was Alexander Hamilton's ally when we're crafting the Constitution and trying to get it ratified. It says, no, the national government, the national bank is unconstitutional. And so this first debate over the constitutionality of the national bank doesn't even end up in the courts. It's not a Supreme Court decision. It's a decision made by George Washington and his cabinet. George Washington sides with Alexander Hamilton, signs the bank's established. And so it's established for a couple decades. Congress even, ends up renewing the charter. And so now let's fast forward a couple of decades to the case of McCulloch v. Maryland. It's 1819. We have a panic, an economic panic. It's really in many ways, the first Great Depression in American history. And there's growing opposition to the national bank, and so bank opponents end up making arguments that echo the same thing that Madison and Jefferson were saying decades earlier. They say the national bank is unconstitutional. It went beyond the powers that are specifically listed in the Constitution. So if you look at your Constitution, you look at Article 1, Section 8, which we reviewed at the beginning, there's no specific power for Congress to charter a national bank. And for these opponents, that's the end of the story. The national government has the powers that are set out in the Constitution. This power is not listed in the Constitution. The national bank is unconstitutional. That's the simple story of the opponents. So what happens in McCulloch v. Maryland? Well, this case comes before John Marshall. It involves a Maryland state law. So it's Maryland passing a state law that effectively tries to undermine the operations of the national bank. What Maryland wants to do is they want to use their state taxing power to tax the national bank out of existence in their state. They, in the end, they want to use the traditional power of the state to tax the national bank and close their branches and undermine their operations in the state. McCulloch is the president of the national bank's branch in Maryland, and he refuses to pay this Maryland tax. And so this sets up a classic debate between Maryland's traditional powers to tax, which states have, versus, the national government's power to charter a national bank. And so John Marshall, the Marshall Court, is going to step in as the Supreme Court for the first time on this key constitutional issue on the scope of the national government's power and specifically on whether it's constitutional to pass a national bank. What does Marshall say? What does the Marshall Court say? Well, they uphold the national bank and they strike down, they block the Maryland tax. And so what does Marshall say? I mean, Marshall's arguments end up paralleling many of the arguments Alexander Hamilton made a few decades earlier. So one, Marshall has to wrestle with the same question the founders wrestled with at the convention and in the ratifying debates over the Constitution, and we've wrestled with through a lot of our history, which is, what is the best way to think of America? Is it we the states, or is it we the people of the United States? And so for Marshall, first in this decision says, he looks back to the preamble, he looks back to popular sovereignty, he looks back to rule by the we the people, and says we are one nation. And here's how Marshall puts it very quickly. He's a wonderful writer. I'm always deeply envious. I'm very jealous of him whenever I read his opinions. But here's Marshall on this question of, are we the people, we the states, or we the people of the United States? Here's Marshall. The government of the Union is emphatically and truly a government of the people. In form and in substance, it emanates from them. Its powers are granted by them and are to be exercised directly on them and for their benefit. And so Marshall, he begins with the preamble. He then moves to that text we talked about at the beginning, the supremacy clause of Article 6. And what he says is what the Constitution sets out, we have a limited government. The national government is not all powerful, but when the national government has power, national law is supreme over state law. When there's a conflict between a national law and a state law, the national law wins. So it's that basic principle of federalism. We do have to figure out if the national government has authority, whether they have the power to pass this, but if they do, they win out over the states. And so then how does Marshall answer the argument of the opponents? There is no clause, there is no part of Article 1, Section 8 or anywhere in the Constitution that says Congress can charter a national bank. So what does Marshall say? Well, what Marshall says is, well, the power to charter a national bank, it's not specifically listed in the Constitution. It's not listed specifically in the text. It's implied by the other powers that you find in the Constitution's text. And so, for instance, the Constitution gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, and on and on. And so what Marshall ends up saying is that those powers combined with what's called the necessary and proper clause, but the idea that Congress and the national government also has the power to do things to carry out the powers that it's been given, that those powers necessarily include the ability to create a national bank. And here's the very famous line from Marshall in this case: we must never forget that it is a constitution we are expounding. And so what Marshall's saying is, it would be impossible for the delegates to the Constitutional Convention to list every single power that we would want Congress to have. The framers wanted the Constitution to be something that we, the people, could read and understand. And if you wanted to list every power, you would end up with something that is hundreds and hundreds of pages long. And so we need to read the Constitution in a way that's consistent with what Marshall took to be the broader project, which was that, having a nation that's able to meet some of the needs of an expanding nation and able to root whatever power they have in what's actually in the text of the Constitution. So I apologize if I went on a little long there, but it ends up being such a fundamental case, and we still debate those same issues over and over throughout American history.
So I think, and this is why, and Tom, no, it was good. We need to dive into this because this is a case that will keep coming up, not just in your classes and in your studies, but in life. Like Tom just said, we keep hearing this over and over. So number one, do they have the right? And that's the ideas in the Constitution, necessary and proper. Think about it. Like, what do you need to do? What are the things that you have that are necessary and proper to do your job, to live your life? That's what's in there for the Constitution. So Marshall says, the Constitution says to do their job, they do what's necessary and proper. So they have the power. And then if they choose to do it, they win because that is the Constitution, and the Constitution is supreme. That's the supremacy clause. So it really spells it out, and by the courts defining it. And that's the job of the courts. The job of the courts is to interpret the Constitution and give clarity between the branches and what the law says. So that's why this case is so important, because it's saying, in the case of federalism, the battle between the national government and the states, in this case, who's going to win? And this is where they spell it out. The national government, because they're doing their job under necessary and proper, and because it's in the Constitution, they reign supreme. I love using the word supreme at any point in time for a supremacy clause. So it really kind of lays it out. Now, when we think about this, we can look at federalism and see a lot of power going into the national government. And that's what the Constitution did. Before that, we had the Articles of Confederation and no real power in the national government. So they write a constitution that gives more power, but not everything. So Tom, we have 5 minutes to fast forward to two modern pieces. So I'm going to super duper fast forward us to a topic. And I know this says civil rights era, but I really want to look at education because I want to make sure the students don't walk away thinking federalism means the national government has all the power. I want to look at education and say, how does education work and how is it broken up between that national government, the state governments, and the local governments, and really quickly look at desegregation of schools and Brown versus Board of Ed. 2 minutes.
So absolutely, yeah. So I mean, yeah, it is really important. I'm glad you emphasized it, Kerry, that just because we give the national government more power doesn't mean that the states don't do a ton. And through a lot of our history, do most policy that set most things in most areas. So that's a really important point. What we get as we get into the 20th century here with Brown versus Board of Education is this question of how do we balance traditional policies set by the states and local governments, like education policy, against what we find in the Constitution after the Civil War, which is a promise of equality that's enforced in the Constitution itself, in the courts, and can be enforced by laws passed by Congress. And so the balance struck with Brown versus Board. So Brown versus Board of Education is asking this question: can states use their traditional powers over the schools, over education, to separate African-American students from white students? The courts had allowed this over time, but the Supreme Court in Brown famously said, no, you can't do that. That flies in the face of the Equal Protection Clause, the promise of equality written into the 14th Amendment. And so what this sets up is, sort of on the one hand, a conflict between the national governments and states and local governments. So it's the national government through the Supreme Court saying, no, all states, you have to follow this rule. We have authority. We can look back at the 14th Amendment. We have the Equal Protection Clause. We can do this. But what this still does is there are all sorts of things that then states and localities, as long as they meet the requirements of Brown versus Board of Education, the promise of racial equality, can set all sorts of rules about basically everything else when it comes to education policy. And so states and localities are primarily responsible for coming up with, everything from school district lines, all the way to what ends up being taught in the classroom. And so you end up with a balance between certain constitutional baselines being set by the Supreme Court and by Congress that apply through the entire nation, but specific policies, and that's the nitty gritty, how much money go to schools, things like that, a nitty gritty that really is determined by the state and local governments. And so that's really, it's on the one hand, a division of labor, but on the other hand, it's a creative tension and sometimes just outright conflict between the national governments and state and local governments.
So a lot of the times it makes sense though, because the local and state government know their students the best, know their communities the best, so they should have power to say this is what's going to happen in our education. The way Delaware is very different than Pennsylvania, depending on California, but like that coming into play makes full sense of why the local governments, why the state governments would have more control over it and the federal government would have less. So let's fast forward to a modern question, and we're going to ask all of our students, including all of our clones, this question. Can a state impose temporary limits on the number of people that may gather in order to stop the spread of a contagious virus, even if that means shutting down religious gatherings over 100 people? And then I'm going to ask you the second question. Can the federal government do that? So can the states do it? Can the federal government do it? So go from there. And then where do we go from there? Give you guys a minute to answer. Not just the clones, everybody. Jack said yes. Milo said yes. Yes. Selena, are you answering? No, I had to fix the fact that I was butchering Selena's name earlier, so I'm saying it right this time. Krishna said yes. Good job. Thank you. Yes. Caleb, yes. Absolutely. Okay. Tom, break it down for us. When we're looking at things like limits on temporary gatherings because of a virus, because of an epidemic that we're going through, can states do that? And then what's the balance between what federal government can do and what state governments can do and what local governments can do? Mm-hmm. You have 2 minutes.
Oh, excellent. No, so the answer is, and it's a bit frustrating, but it's sometimes, and it depends. Because I mean, what these cases bring up, let's begin at the state level, because that's where most of these debates are happening in the courts. What it puts against one another is, one, a state's traditional powers to promote the health and safety of its citizens, and it puts it against, you know, key rights that we find enshrined in the Constitution, like the right to free exercise. And so there's no way to deny that there is a conflict there. And so what we end up seeing over time is, you know, one, there is some Supreme Court case law on this question. The key case is a case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts from 1905. So there was a smallpox outbreak in Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts state government said, local governments, you can pass laws to force people to get vaccinated for smallpox. That's the only way we're going to address this particular danger. And the Supreme Court heard this case and said, yes, that is within the traditional powers of the state. Even though people came and brought constitutional challenges under the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court, with Justice John Marshall Harlan writing, said this is okay. This is within the traditional powers of the states to keep their citizens safe. And, you know, to be clear, Harlan did say there could be laws that are so arbitrary, that make so little sense, that are so oppressive, that they would be unconstitutional. So it's not just a blanket rule that states can do whatever they want, but that in an area like public health, when there is a genuine public health concern, the courts are generally going to let states shape policies that states will have some flexibility to shape policies that they can explain as reasonable. And so this is sort of that's the framework the Supreme Court gives. This specific hypothetical actually came before the Supreme Court in a case called South Bay United Pentecostal Church versus Newsom. So just a couple of months ago, and it divided the court 6-3. And so the court ultimately upheld this order by the California governor. But even there's an opinion written by Chief Justice Roberts who upheld the governor's order. But even there, he said, this is this is going to turn on the specifics of the situation. We have to really look at the facts on the ground. And I think the framework of how you think about this is, you know, when we're at the maximum danger because of something like a pandemic outbreak, the state's traditional powers to keep us safe and healthy are at their maximum. They're at their highest level. But as the crisis goes on, maybe as the danger goes down, the court might strike a balance differently. And as the court strikes a different balance, it may begin to ask harder questions of the states and local governments as to whether or not they need to do these things. For the dissenters in this specific case, they looked at the specifics of this order and said, you're allowing certain secular businesses like grocery stores to remain open, but you're shutting down religious gatherings. That's discrimination against religious groups. It violates the First Amendment. And therefore, this order has to go. And so you can see the dividing lines between, on the one hand, the majority upholding the California governor's order, saying we have to look at the facts on the ground, but generally speaking, we're going to give the states a lot of flexibility, versus the dissenters who are saying, no, we have a constitution that lays out important rights and we have to take those rights seriously. And it's not to say that California can't do things that are going to affect religious gatherings, but they have to have a really, 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 really good reason if what they're doing is saying religious gatherings must close, but businesses may remain open.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to, like, when you're looking at that case, the Supreme Court is saying, like, look closely. It's not a blanket. They cannot, so like I just highlighted some of the things that you were saying, Tom. In this question, it says temporary limits, spread of a contagious virus. So it's a certain defined time. It has a really good reason because of public health, or what we were talking about, the policing powers of the state. And don't think cops when you think of that. Think of like, how do you police something? The way my mom used to say it when I was a kid, I'm policing you, meaning you're making sure I get my homework done. And then there's a defining size over 100 people. So all those pieces come through. But what I want you guys to do for the next like 2 weeks is look and see, where do you see that spread of federalism and whose job is it? So whose job it is in your local community to do one part in the state level and in the national level. Because next week, we're going to be talking about the Electoral College. And this is a perfect example of how federalism works. Whose job is it to look at elections? How does it work? And what's the role of the national, the state, and the local government? Really interesting conversations, really interesting facts. Now, one thing, Selena, I also did want to let you know, and for everybody that's out there, that when we talk about Article 5 and the amendment process, we will be doing that class the week of January 25th. So you might have to wait a little bit, but Stacy Garber put an awesome explanation in the chat box if you want to see the simple breakdown of it. But if you want to do a whole half an hour class on it, hang out with us the week of January 5th, and we're going to break down the amendment process. We'll talk about prohibition. We'll talk about some really crazy times in American history and how the 27 amendments came to be. So very fun class. Thank you all so much. If you have questions, we'll hang out afterwards. But if not, we'll see you next class. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.